Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY. Damian on Design with Damian Farrell, each week taking a look at design and its impact on our lives.
Yeah. And an old friend and a second-time guest for us. And touching on a topic we really haven't touched much on in the 4 years that we've been doing this. Landscape architecture, landscape design, the impact of the environment from that point of view, not just the buildings and the architecture point of view. So a piece we've really missed for a while, and I think Peter Osler is the perfect person to have in here this morning to talk about some of this with your incredible background.
Shame on you, Dave.
I know. I accept the shame. Mea culpa.
And since we last had Peter Osler on the show here on 1290 WLBY, you have become an associate professor and a director of the Landscape Architecture program, which actually didn't exist until you came on board at Lawrence Technological University.
Well, in fact, it has yet to.
You're building it.
Yes, I'm in the
It's showing
process
promise at this point,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Everything looks good right now. Yeah, we'll be launching the program probably in the fall of 2016. That's our goal.
Okay.
So.
What are you doing to construct the program? What kinds of elements will go into it?
Well, that's a very interesting question because landscape architecture has changed a lot. The emphasis, contrary to what a lot of people might think, is not so much on designing backyards. At the residential scale, it has more to do with urbanism, the issue of cities and how cities are designed, how we can make cities work better and be healthier and more meaningful, and work better. I think ecologically is a huge part of it. So really it's larger scale, more ambitious than what a lot of people I think are aware of. So that will be the tack of the program is an emphasis on the city, especially on Detroit as a laboratory. Lots of work to do in Detroit, obviously. And I think landscape can play a vital role in getting Detroit back to probably a new vision, not kind of thinking of it nostalgically, the way trying to recreate the past, but really thinking of it as a laboratory for making a new kind of American city.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate that into cities that, like Detroit, coming out of the ashes as it were, funding is tight. They're trying to attract business in. Business wants to build up Detroit. How do you make sure that the element of landscape architecture isn't forgotten?
Well, landscape's pretty cheap when it comes down to it compared to buildings, and there's a role that landscape can play in for instance, remediating toxic land.
Right.
There's, I think, more emphasis now on healthy lifestyles, which involves spending more time outdoors. There's much more emphasis these days on thinking of what we can do to improve the environment. So things like stormwater management, those kinds of issues have become pretty strictly regulated.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're getting into trying to figure out ways of not just solving the problem, but in fact bringing kind of beauty and legibility and kind of great space making to those issues. So you can manage stormwater by throwing it underground into a tank, or you can actually do something on the surface and provide habitat for animals and places for people to recreate and wonderful things to look at and be in.
So it works in synergy with everything else going on in a city.
Yeah, and especially again with Detroit, where you have a lot of vacant land, how that land is developed with buildings. I think people are becoming more aware that it needs to have the kind of reciprocal relationship with open space.
Actually, that touches on one of our recent guests, John Gallagher, who writes for the Detroit Free Press, has written about Detroit, 2 books now, and some of the new Detroit plans talk about thinking about this differently from the point of view we're probably going to have these pockets of urban development, but in between lots of green space, and that seems to be a terrific opportunity.
Yeah. And that land can be used for anything from maybe more traditional, what one might think of traditional park usage, to things like urban agriculture,
Right.
Forestry, urban forestry, wildlife habitat, all kinds of things.
Wouldn't it be extraordinary to literally see forestation happening in the middle of a city that's coming back. I mean, to
Yeah.
drive down the street and be in the shade of a stand of evergreens or something, or a whole park full of trees planted closely together, not just in a traditional park sense, but actual forestation. I mean,
Yeah,
it's amazing.
you see this in Europe, not necessarily in the center of cities where things are fairly dense, but on the perimeter, especially in places like the Netherlands, where
Right.
even their national parks are heavily managed and harvested. So that kind of working landscape is I think quite a compelling landscape to think of. Not again a nostalgic image of nature as I think a lot of people think of it as, but in fact something that's a bit more active and productive.
Active and
And
productive.
performing, that's another popular word these days, is
So-
how landscapes can be performative.
So in other words, like the management of the water
Yeah,
resources
yeah.
that you had talked about.
Yep, remediating toxic soils, all kinds of things, yeah.
So going back a little in time, both from Harvard, you a master in landscape architecture and a master in architecture,
Yeah.
with a short gap between the two.
Yes,
That sets you up for a very unusual, very different career going forward. And
yeah.
you've made good use of that, certainly,
Well-
when you look at the things that you've done.
Fair amount of
And then leading to the
student
Rome
debt.
Prize. And the Rome Prize is my curiosity. I mean, that's a big deal, the Rome Prize. But what did it mean to you? How did that come about?
Yeah, it's a ways back now. It was in the early 2000s, but I had a really amazing opportunity to work at Cranbrook.
Right.
I was hired as the campus architect there, and then quickly segued into a position which didn't exist, which was campus landscape architect and planner. And that was a result of, in the midst of their very ambitious building program where they had hired a lot of noteworthy architects
Mhm.
to do new facilities there, the site designs for those projects were problematic in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
And so I became the person, in essence, who took over a lot of the site designs for those projects. And through that work, I had a wonderful relationship with a very well-known architect named Todd Williams, who was
Yeah.
doing a building there, and he became an advocate for me, and encouraged me to apply for that.
Okay.
And it was really out of the experiences that I had at Cranbrook, actually, and I would have to say, just go into a little bit of detail, I worked with a grounds crew there and a grounds superintendent, and we oftentimes had very different views
Mhm.
on how the landscape at Cranbrook should be designed, how it should be managed, and he was coming from a more traditional kind of horticultural approach, and I was trying to be a bit more, I think, nuanced in terms of Cranbrook's history,
Mhm.
not, again, being nostalgic about it, but kind of advancing it, really, which is I think, consistent with the spirit of Saarinen through his career there,
Right.
not being fixed in one style or a
Yeah.
way of thinking, but in fact advancing throughout his career. And we really butted heads, and it was through that frustration of seeing how from the management side people want to tend landscapes, and then from my point as a designer, I came up with an idea which really had to do with what I call the poetics of maintenance, kind of
Okay.
how, if you think of Europe and how the gardens and landscapes have been managed over time, it's a much more sophisticated kind of subject,
Mhm.
which is influenced by, for instance, the evolution of tools,
Okay.
trades, the education of tradespeople, things like that. And so it's a pretty interesting subject, I think.
How does that relate to, I understand you won a prize for a proposal entitled Times Way, Times Where, and the Poetics of Shears.
Right.
And this was a proposal in Europe?
That was the Rome Prize proposal, yeah. So the Rome Prize is a really fantastic opportunity. It's something where, a prize where you get to spend a year at what's called the American Academy in Rome, which is a arts and humanities facility with poets and musical composers, historians and designers, fantastic group of people, great tradition there. And you can really do whatever you want. There's no, for instance, requirement to have anything at the end of the year. So it's an amazing luxury to have that kind of freedom to pursue what you want to pursue. So, you know, for instance, a lot of people go there thinking they're going to do a very specific thing, and then once they get there, they realize there are other opportunities and maybe roadblocks in certain ways that prevent you from doing the thing that you would originally thought you would do, and so you're free to kind of migrate and change your thought. In fact, at least my process of research going there was to spend time in the archives and libraries and things. But in fact, what I didn't realize is that there was an incredibly active process of landscape management on the grounds of the academy itself. So I spent a lot of time with the gardeners there, videoing them and photographing them, and so it turned into a project that I never would have imagined, really.
So the reference to Poetics of Shears, talk about that.
Well, the people think of designers, I think, as being perhaps through their education and supposed intellect as being the great, perhaps arbiters or the people who give shape to, in terms of landscape design, the way we relate to nature.
Yeah.
And that's true to a certain extent, but in fact, what happens, of course, is that the designer designs something, it gets constructed, and then they leave. And then it's in the hands of others to maintain that vision. And in fact, landscape is a medium that changes.
It tends to grow, doesn't it?
It grows, it dies, it dies.
It dies, yes.
It gets diseases, cultural norms change, budgets change, again, tools change, climate changes, and so landscapes change, and owners change, programs change, all that stuff. So anyways, how landscapes change over time is quite, I think, interesting. We typically understand landscapes through, perhaps historic landscapes, through iconic images,
Right.
and you tend to think of them in a fixed way, but in fact, many of the great historic landscapes hadn't undergone a lot of change. So it's really kind of giving credence giving credence to those who aren't, who don't tend to be revered. You know, the designers tend to be put up on a pedestal, but in fact, the landscape maintenance people have the potential, in fact, to play an incredible role.
Yeah.
Now, the problem, of course, is that people don't want to pay a lot for it. It tends to get dumbed down, and so you end up with a certain kind of labor force that isn't appreciated, which I think is a real tragedy. And so
That's a good point.
I
That's a very
think
good
the
point.
respect of the skill, which I think is quite astounding, actually. People who work in the field every day have a lot of empirical knowledge about the performance of things, the behavior of plants, all kinds of the soil. They have a feel for that kind of thing that designers oftentimes don't.
Talking with landscape architect Peter Osler on Damian on Design with Damian Farrell, architect with Damian Farrell Design Group. Peter brings up something I had never thought about before, and that is indeed, you have the creators of things,
Yes.
of whether it's landscape or a beautiful building, as your father did as well, Peter. But then it's up to those who either own them or the people that they hire to bring in to keep them up, to maintain them. Because you can point to a building in town and say it's a so-and-so building, but if it hasn't been lovingly kept in the tradition that it was intended to, it doesn't mean the same as it did when it was first made or created.
Yeah, you take something on the scale of Central Park, for instance.
Mhm.
Can you imagine what must go in to maintaining and you take a walk through the park and it looks static, right? Other than leaves are moving, things are growing, things are blooming or not, pond is frozen or it's not. But behind all that is this growth and energy and activity that's going on.
Yeah.
And maintaining that must be just an extraordinary exercise.
Yeah. Well, and that's again something that's really changed about landscape architecture. It used to be that, and I would say that I was trained back in the '80s to think of landscapes as objects. It was a very art with a capital A kind of approach. You were making not paintings per se, but you might think of landscapes as being very sculptural. And we thought of them as somewhat as fixed objects, and that's completely different now. It's really, we're thinking about contingencies, processes that are more open-ended, thinking of landscapes somewhat as being staged, you know, you kind of
Yes.
set things in motion.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that things can't, that landscapes can't be legible. That's another problem, I would say, at the opposite end from the problem of landscapes being fixed is to approach landscapes as being, in essence, in some ways, undesigned, or that you should just let them be. And I think that that's a problem too. I know in my own work I try to strike a balance where these things are operating with each other all the time,
Yeah.
or against one another somehow in some kind of discourse between the two. I think that's where the
But it's
best.
a real art form in that balance, isn't it? I mean, that's really the core of it, isn't it? Is to make it look effortless, elegant.
Well, yeah, again, now effortless, I suppose, is like all great work, whether it's a building or not. It might, when you look at a building, you understand that it's been designed, it's been constructed. Landscapes, I guess I think the best landscapes, again, are ones that one sees the hand of the designer.
Yeah.
It's not about pretending that you're not there.
Yeah.
But I do think that landscape does offer that amazing range. You know, at one end, it can be something that you may have designed and constructed, but you don't see that hand so
Yeah.
clearly, and then at the other end, something that's obviously very, very precise and
Very
fixed. And
designed
so again, there's a
Right.
huge range in there, and the best designs, I think, are ones that aren't at either extreme. They're the ones that, in fact, operate somewhere in the middle.
So Peter, as you look at different landscapes across America, can you tell who designed them? Are you able to tell? Do each of you have a hallmark of
Well, I
the
think
body
that,
of your
you know,
work?
signature,
Mhm.
whatever. Yeah, certainly. I mean, when you're within the profession, you spend a lot of time reading, and you're aware of what's going on in the profession.
What about,
So.
but for a layperson, what should they be looking for when they look at these kinds of things?
Well, that's a good question. Well, spatial organization would be one thing. Whether or not, depending on the scale of the landscape, you know, some landscapes are huge, and so again, something like a national park, something like that is a landscape, and it has infrastructure, it has roads, it has lots of buildings in it. That's been designed as well, at least in some parts. But if we think about gardens or parks, let's say, how spaces are organized, how legible they are, do you feel an intensification of place, I guess. I think a lot of people tend to, it's a little bit like looking at your cell phone. You kind of fall asleep a bit, you become less aware, and I think sometimes people, when they go out into nature, let's call it whatever, in a park or something, they kind of, they in some ways almost kind of fall asleep. They're not really aware, and they're not really, and I would say that a lot of parks are very passive as well.
Yeah.
So they don't really ask much of you.
Yeah.
And so that's problematic. But if you go into a great park, I think it's just like going into a great building. You know that there's something there, that it has to do with the way that the topography has been shaped. It has to do with what you're seeing, what you're not seeing, especially as one moves through a space. Things are revealed to you. Your senses are intensified. You smell. It's not just a sight-oriented phenomenon. It's something which really engages all your senses.
Peter, I haven't been to New York and experienced the High Line. Have you been able?
Well, I haven't been to
about
the final phase, but
Okay.
I've been through the first two phases.
Is it a completely different kind of experience? Does it do something different other than just walking through a park or a green space? Do you think people are aware of something different?
I do. That really is a phenomenon as
Is
a
it?
project. It's
Yeah.
it's a great watershed moment, I think, for the profession of landscape architecture. It's really focused a lot of attention on landscape architecture.
Yeah, it is.
For a number of really great reasons. I mean, it was an abandoned piece of infrastructure, so a lot of cities now are, not just Detroit, but a lot of cities that are looking at somehow revitalizing these abandoned pieces of infrastructure. Every city now is kind of looking for their own High Line.
Yeah.
Chicago is constructing one now.
It's changed the way development has happened.
Well,
Isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah, and that's another thing which public space has has relatively recently, I think, come into the fore because they've really been able to measure now more
Yeah.
accurately the effect it's had on real estate values. So something like Millennium Park, I think, was,
Yes.
which came
Great
before the
example,
High Line,
yeah.
was very notable for the, hundreds of millions of dollars that it spawned in terms of real estate value and
Right.
development. And the High Line's the same way.
Yeah.
So,
Because people want to be near those?
yeah.
Yeah.
They're beautiful spaces, they're very active, they tend to draw a lot of other kinds of development, which people want to be around, good restaurants, art venues, things like that. So it's a real synergistic kind of phenomenon that happens when you get one of those successful public spaces.
Peter Osler and Damian Farrell, we've been talking about some major spaces, major
Yeah.
projects, national types of open spaces. Let's bring it home to Ann Arbor. I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on the green belt, on Ann Arbor trying to get more open space in downtown, trying to manage that a little bit better with the building that's going on downtown.
Uh-huh.
What's your thought on how Ann Arbor is approaching this?
Well, I was on the Greenway Committee years ago before I moved away, and I haven't kept up with it, so I don't know what its current state is. I think the Greenway as an idea is a fantastic one. I think it's something that, again, if you think about open space as a vital part of the infrastructure of any healthy city, I think it's something which Ann Arbor will be, in the long run, I think would be happy to have, would be
Yeah.
thankful to have. Again, I think it's a lot of it personally would have to do with how it's done.
Yeah.
It's again, and not. I think it can go beyond just thinking of it as being a natural space. What at least what most people would think of as being natural. I think it would have to be, I think, designed in some ways, in some
Mhm.
places at least, be very intensively used.
Yeah.
So there has to be a purpose to space? Open space?
Well, I think that purpose is, it might be a bit different than what you might think of it as being relative to, again, a building,
Mhm.
which tends to be a bit more fixed or more specific. There are rooms for certain things, and in landscape, it's a bit more fluid. I
Mhm.
mean, there certainly are, when you go to a park, there might be fields for certain sports or
Yes.
play equipment. Certainly there is that kind of thing. But I think that there's again a huge range at your disposal of the kind of intensities of use that one can and that one would want to have in a large piece of infrastructure like that.
I don't think we've done nearly enough with our beautiful treasure, the Huron River.
Oh, boy, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, you can actually be in this town as a visitor for probably a week or so before you even know that we have a river running
That's
through our
true.
city.
Yeah.
We're so disjointed from it, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, O.C. Simons, who was a great landscape architect in the late 19th, early 20th century, who designed the Nichols Arboretum and a number of significant projects in Chicago, he did a plan, I think, early on that had to do that looked at the Huron River corridor, and yes, it's a vital resource. I would say that things. My own opinion is that things in Ann Arbor tend to get polarized a bit. You have you have people who are very anti-development, who don't want change. I mean, I think that the best cities are the ones that do in fact embrace change. They do it, but they do it intelligently. They do it with skill and with quality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the problem with recent Ann Arbor development isn't from, again, personally, not so much from the increase in density or the taller buildings, but in fact the quality of those buildings.
Yes.
They're very, very mediocre.
Very well
They're
said.
clumsy. They're
Yes.
big, chunky blocks, and
It's very,
Why do you think that is? Are we choosing the wrong people to work on them? Are we going outside? Are we not looking at our own internal talent? What are your thoughts on that?
well, I think it's a mix of a lot of things. I think development is hard. Development is hard, and developing in Ann Arbor is really hard.
And very expensive.
Very expensive, which
Yes.
so it's, building should be hard.
Mhm.
There's no question about it. The problem is that what happens is that things get, you spend so much time getting projects through approvals
Right.
that what's left over ends up the budgets get squeezed. I think the architects that tend to be hired aren't maybe perhaps the best architects. It's.
So are other towns doing it differently?
I think I think it would be interesting to look at college towns.
Yeah,
Somebody,
good
I don't know
point.
if
Yes.
anyone's done a PhD thesis or a dissertation on college town development, because it seems like they're unique ecosystems
Yeah, right.
and economies, and larger cities, of course, do it differently. There's got premium on. Well, we were talking about Vancouver. I just spent 4 days in Vancouver. There's a lot of really mediocre architecture in a very sophisticated city like. Even in New York, I mean, you hear about the great buildings. Those are the ones that make the magazines and stuff. There's a lot of great buildings there, but there are a lot of mediocre buildings too. So so in a place like Ann Arbor, where in fact, relatively, there's not a lot of development.
And it's already coming around the student market, right? I mean, most of our new projects in our so-called high-rise are student housing, isn't it? I mean, isn't that really?
Yeah.
It's contemporary student housing. It's more this hotel lifestyle. But I think that has brought its own aesthetic across the country as well, which is sort of what you're talking about. I mean, it's, yes, it takes so much money to get through the process here, but they're not great buildings, and they could be. There's no reason why they couldn't be.
And back to Peter's point about the fact that if those buildings were great buildings, it wouldn't be that we're building up or building out, but in relationship to the land, it's just how you fit everything in correctly.
Well, that's part of it, but I think in the downtown, you're not going to have a lot of green space around buildings. That's fine. It's fine. It's not every building has to sit in the middle of a park. It's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. Cities are dense; they want to be dense. It's where they get their vitality. So, but for instance, the proportion of buildings is something which is problematic. And again, it's a tough thing because you get a piece of land, you need to put as much square footage on it as you can. I don't know who did it, but there's I think in terms of massing, a very good building along Huron, across from Sloan Plaza, on the south side of Huron, near City Hall, but a bit east of City Hall.
Okay.
I think just in terms of proportion, it's more of a thin slab that goes up.
Yes.
It's actually an L-shaped building, and so the way that building meets the street has a very thin facade.
Right. And it's very open on the street level too.
Yeah. So that to me is points in a more hopeful direction about tall buildings in a place like Ann Arbor. I think also a lot of the kind of fatter buildings in Ann Arbor, in some ways maybe they try to do too much. They're fighting an uphill battle proportionally, and then they try to laden on cornices and things that try to, and that appeases a lot of people. A lot of the public want to have a building that perhaps looks old or somehow looks.
There's a podium in the middle and a cap right over the top.
And that's been, I think, pretty unsuccessful when you look at the Ann Arbor buildings, the most recent ones.
Interesting conversation today with landscape architect Peter Osler, along with Damian Farrell from Damian Farrell Design Group. Can't wait to hear more about your program when it gets underway at Lawrence Technological University, the brand new landscape architecture program.
Yeah, have me back.
We definitely will.
We will. We're big fans of LTU.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you.
And more coming up on the Lucy Ann Land Show. Damian Farrell's Damian on Design each weekend here on Ann Arbor's Talk Station, 1290 WLBY.
Great.